Imagine standing on a battlefield in Europe in 1944. The ground trembles as steel giants roll across the torn earth, their engines roaring like thunder. Ahead of you are the German Panthers and Tigers, monsters of war, wrapped in thick armor and armed with guns that can punch through nearly anything the Allies throw at them. Soldiers whisper that nothing can stop these beasts, that to face them is to face certain death. And yet, time after time, a different machine rolls forward. It is smaller, lighter, often mocked as weak and fragile. But somehow this unassuming tank, the American Sherman, keeps appearing at the right place, at the right time, winning battles it was never supposed to win. To German troops this seemed impossible. How could the Sherman, a tank they called inferior, stand against the engineering marvels of the Reich? It wasn't just about bravery or numbers or luck. The secret lay hidden in something invisible, something the Germans had never valued as much as the Americans did. It wasn't a gun, it wasn't armor, it wasn't even speed. It was a weapon of the mind, a weapon of connection, a weapon that turned scattered machines into a single unstoppable force: radios. From the very beginning, every Sherman rolled off the assembly line with a radio set as standard. It was an afterthought to some, but in truth, it was one of the most advanced battlefield communication tools of its time. And it gave the Allies a power Germany's mightiest tanks could never match: the ability to coordinate, to adapt, to strike as one. This simple technology, often ignored in tales of steel and fire, became the invisible shield that made the Sherman invincible against Germany's best. The Second World War was more than a clash of weapons. It was a clash of ideas. When tanks first roared onto the battlefields of Europe in 1939, the world gasped. Germany's blitzkrieg tactics showed how armor could rip through defenses faster than infantry or artillery could react. Panzer divisions seemed like the future of war, unstoppable mechanized avalanches of steel. Against this backdrop, the Sherman tank, first appearing in 1942, was almost laughable. Lighter, with thinner armor and a less powerful gun, it often lost in one-on-one duels against German Panthers or Tigers. The Germans sneered, calling it the Ronson after the cigarette lighter, because once hit, it often burst into flames. And yet the story of war is not written by duels. It is written by systems, by strategies, by the hidden threads that connect armies together. The Germans had poured their genius into designing fearsome tanks that could outshoot and outlast any rival. But they had overlooked something subtle, something less glamorous but ultimately more decisive. Where the Germans trusted in individual machines, the Americans trusted in the network that connected them. And at the heart of that network was the humble radio. In the chaos of battle, communication is everything. A tank alone is blind, deaf, a steel coffin waiting to be cracked open. But a tank connected to others becomes part of something greater. With radios, Sherman crews could call out threats, share enemy positions, and coordinate movements with precision. A single German Tiger might destroy 3 Shermans in a row, but by the time it turned its turret, 5 more Shermans would already be moving to flank it, guided by voices crackling over radio waves. For German crews, it was baffling. They were used to fighting isolated duels, where superior armor and guns carried the day. But again and again, they found themselves ambushed, outmaneuvered, overwhelmed. To them, it seemed as if the Americans had some kind of supernatural foresight, some uncanny knowledge of where to strike. In reality, it was the invisible threads of radio communication, weaving Shermans into a single coordinated organism that turned the tide. As the war dragged on, the difference grew sharper. German factories, strained by Allied bombing and shortages, often left radios out of tanks to save time and materials. In many units, only the commander's tank had a set. Ordinary panzer crews were forced to rely on hand signals, flags, or even runners on foot to relay messages. Imagine the chaos. Shells exploding, smoke filling the air, engines roaring, and in the middle of it all, a commander waving a flag from his turret. Against that, the Americans had an orchestra of steel, every tank a voice in the chorus, every crew linked by unseen lines of information. This was the secret weapon of the Sherman. Not its armor, not its gun, but its ability to act as part of a living, breathing system of war. And it was this weapon that would carry the Allies through the hedgerows of France, across the rivers of Belgium, and into the heart of Germany itself. In the summer of 1944, after the beaches of Normandy had been stormed and secured, the Allies faced a new nightmare. The French countryside was cut into tight, winding hedgerows, thick earth walls laced with roots and trees, forming a maze where every field became a fortress. German tanks and anti-tank guns lay hidden in ambush, waiting for the Americans to push forward. For many Sherman crews, it was a baptism of fire. The moment they nosed through a hedgerow, a shell would rip through their armor. Panthers and tigers prowled with predatory patience, waiting for the kill. And yet something extraordinary happened. Rather than collapsing under these losses, the Shermans adapted. Each time a tank was lost, nearby crews used their radios to warn others. Panther in the next hedgerow, 11 o'clock. Within moments, 3 more Shermans would shift, maneuvering to encircle the German position. Alone, any one of those Shermans might have been outgunned. Together, guided by constant chatter over the airwaves, they turned the battlefield into a deadly chessboard. This ability to coordinate in real time turned disaster into opportunity. German tanks, though technically superior, were often cut off from one another. A Tiger tank could smash through a frontal fight, but without radios in every vehicle, its allies often didn't even know where it was, or what it was facing. The Sherman, by contrast, was never truly alone. A hit on one tank became a signal for the others. A loss was not the end of a fight, but the start of a counterstrike. One American tanker later recalled, "We weren't better than the Germans in one tank against one tank, but we were better at fighting as a team. With radios, we were never blind." His words captured the essence of why Shermans, often derided as weak, became such relentless hunters. They didn't win by brute strength, but by intelligence, by teamwork, by voices whispering across static-laced channels in the heat of battle. The Germans noticed. At first they mocked the Sherman, calling it Tommy Cooker or Ronson, convinced it was little more than a target. But after Normandy, their tone began to change. Reports surfaced of Shermans striking from multiple angles at once, appearing where they weren't expected. German commanders grew paranoid, unsure how American tankers seemed to always know where to hit. They didn't realize the truth. It wasn't luck. It was radios turning chaos into coordination. By the time of Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy in late July 1944, the Sherman's hidden advantage became undeniable. Waves of American armor, each tank linked by radio, punched holes through German defenses. When one formation stalled, another moved to exploit the gap. German Tigers tried to resist, but they were surrounded, overwhelmed, forced to retreat. It was the orchestra of Shermans, each one a voice in the chorus, that made the breakthrough possible. The effect was psychological as much as physical. German crews inside their massive tanks began to feel hunted, not hunters. A Tiger might destroy 3, even 4 Shermans in an engagement. But just as it swung its turret toward the 5th, it would take a strike from the side, its armor pierced, its crew scrambling to escape the fire. For the Americans, the radios gave them confidence. For the Germans, it sowed doubt. Each clash reinforced the same message. No matter how strong your machine, you cannot fight the swarm. By autumn 1944, as the Allies raced toward the German border, the pattern repeated itself again and again. Radios turned raw numbers into precision. When a column of Shermans advanced, it wasn't chaos, it was choreography. They spoke, they warned, they guided each other like pieces of a single organism. To the Germans, who still relied on hand signals and scattered orders, it was as if the enemy could think with one mind. This invisible edge would prove crucial in the greatest test of all. The Ardennes, December 1944, when Germany launched its desperate counteroffensive known as the Battle of the Bulge. Snow-covered forests, fog-filled valleys, and bitter cold turned the battlefield into a nightmare. German Panthers and Tigers surged forward, hoping to break the Allied lines once and for all. The Americans were caught off guard, many units scattered and outnumbered. In those first days, chaos reigned. But once again, radios became the lifeline. Tank crews trapped in icy villages whispered coordinates to artillery. Columns cut off by German advances called reinforcements before being surrounded. Shermans, fighting desperately in the snow, guided each other through the fog, flanking enemy tanks that believed they were striking unseen. In the Ardennes, where visibility was often no more than a few dozen yards, radios were the eyes of the Sherman. They allowed American armor to regroup, to counterattack, to blunt the edge of Germany's last gamble. The truth became clear. Without radios, the Sherman might have been outmatched. With them, it was unbeatable, not because it was the strongest, but because it was never alone. In September 1944, the rolling hills of Lorraine in northeastern France became the stage for one of the most dramatic tank clashes of the war. The Battle of Arracourt. On paper, it should have been a massacre. The Germans had sent some of their best armored divisions, freshly reinforced with Panther tanks, sleek machines with powerful 75mm guns, and thick frontal armor that could shrug off most Sherman shells. Facing them was a smaller American force, largely Shermans, commanded by the seasoned but outnumbered 4th Armored Division. The odds were stacked heavily in Germany's favor. Panthers outgunned the Shermans, their armor nearly impenetrable from the front. Yet over the course of 2 weeks, the unimaginable happened. The Americans destroyed or disabled nearly 200 German tanks while losing fewer than 30 Shermans. The numbers didn't lie. Something far more powerful than steel had shaped the outcome. That power was communication. The fields around Arracourt were shrouded in early morning fog, reducing visibility to almost nothing. German commanders expected this to play into their hands. They believed their superior armor could roll forward blindly and smash whatever lay ahead. But the Americans had radios, and with them, eyes in the fog. Tank commanders used constant communication to track enemy movements, redirect units, and coordinate with artillery and aircraft. A Panther might emerge from the mist, its gun roaring, only to be flanked within minutes by Shermans working in unison. Each American crew could warn the others instantly, reporting "Panther spotted near the ridge" or "enemy moving left flank." Within moments, Shermans shifted like a school of fish, encircling their prey. One German officer later admitted his shock. He described American tanks moving as if controlled by a single hand. What he couldn't see was the invisible web of radio chatter guiding every move. The Germans, still limited in radio distribution and crippled by fuel shortages, often attacked piecemeal. Panthers charged into battle unaware of what their neighbors were doing, while the Shermans, though weaker individually, fought like a pack of wolves. The Battle of Arracourt wasn't just a victory. It was proof. Proof that the Sherman's greatest strength wasn't its gun, nor its armor, but the ability to act as one unified force. This was the moment when German tank crews realized their nightmare. They weren't fighting individual machines. They were fighting an entire system that thought, moved, and struck together. The psychological effect was devastating. German crews went into combat knowing their tanks were superior, but increasingly, they left the battlefield shaken. Panthers and Tigers might destroy Shermans in head-to-head encounters, but time and again, they were outmaneuvered. For every German victory in a duel, the Americans replied with a coordinated ambush. The Sherman had transformed from prey to predator. This invisible advantage reached its peak in the Battle of the Bulge. In the freezing forests of Ardennes, German armor surged forward in one last desperate bid. Tigers rumbled through the snow, panthers lurked among the trees, and American forces were caught scattered and under pressure. Yet radios turned panic into resistance. A single Sherman crew under fire could call artillery down within minutes. A pinned column could summon reinforcements before being overrun. Units scattered by the initial German attack quickly reformed, not by orders from distant headquarters, but by tank commanders talking directly to each other over the airwaves. Time and again, German breakthroughs collapsed because Shermans and infantry coordinated with uncanny speed. To the Germans, it seemed like their moves were anticipated, countered before they could build momentum. The truth was simpler and far deadlier. Radios turned chaos into coordination. Radios turned scattered tanks into a wall. Radios turned retreats into counterattacks. By the winter of 1944, the Sherman was no longer the butt of jokes. It was a force multiplier. And German commanders, once confident in their mechanical superiority, now faced a bitter truth. They had built the strongest tanks in the world, but they had failed to build the strongest army. The Americans, with their humble Shermans and their invisible radios, had done that instead. The turning point was clear. Raw power had lost to communication. The war of steel had become a war of voices in the ether, and the Sherman was winning it. By early 1945, the German army was in retreat. Its proud panzer divisions, once feared across Europe, were now shadows of their former selves. On the surface, their tanks were still terrifying machines. A Tiger could still knock out a Sherman with a single shell from over a mile away. A Panther could still dominate any open field it rolled onto. But the psychological advantage had slipped away, and with it, the aura of invincibility that once surrounded the Wehrmacht. Captured German officers, interviewed after the war, revealed something remarkable. Many of them had assumed that the Allies simply had overwhelming numbers everywhere. They believed that the Americans always had more tanks, more planes, more artillery, so many that German forces could never keep up. Yet this wasn't always true. At Arracourt, the Americans were outnumbered. During the Bulge, they were caught off guard. The difference wasn't always quantity, it was quality of coordination. For German tankers, it was maddening. They could outshoot the Shermans. They could outlast them in direct duels. But they could not stop the American war machine from moving faster, responding quicker, and overwhelming them through sheer organization. Many German veterans later admitted they hadn't fully understood the scale of the American advantage until it was far too late. To them, the Sherman wasn't a single tank. It was a node in a vast, living network. Each Sherman carried not just 5 men, but the voices of dozens more. Other crews, infantry, artillery batteries, even pilots overhead. One tank spotted a Tiger. Within minutes, the entire battalion knew where it was. One Sherman got pinned down. Within minutes, artillery shells rained on the enemy position. It was like fighting an enemy that could think and react with dozens of minds at once. For the Americans, this invisible edge became a source of confidence. Sherman crews knew they could call for help. They knew they weren't alone. And that mattered more than armor thickness. A tanker who believed his comrades were always one radio call away fought with a courage that no amount of steel could replace. The aftermath of these battles reshaped how historians saw the Sherman. For decades, the myth persisted that it was an inferior tank, a death trap, a disposable machine thrown into battle by the thousands. But modern research tells a different story. The Sherman's design philosophy wasn't about creating a super tank to rival the Tiger. It was about creating a war-winning system, reliable tanks, endless supply lines, and most importantly, communication that tied it all together. Germany had built Predators. The Americans had built a pack. And in the wild, the pack almost always wins. By the time the Allies crossed into Germany itself, the balance of power was irreversible. Panzer divisions still mounted fierce resistance, But without the ability to coordinate on the same scale, they were like deaf giants swinging in the dark. Meanwhile, the Shermans advanced steadily, supported by artillery strikes that landed with uncanny precision, infantry that moved in lockstep with armor, and aircraft that appeared seemingly on call. The lesson was brutal, but clear. The most dangerous weapon on a battlefield isn't always the gun that fires the loudest. Sometimes, it's the voice that carries through the static. Wars are remembered for their thunder, the roar of cannons, the scream of dive bombers, the clash of steel against steel. Generations grow up remembering the monsters of battle, the Tiger tank, the Panther, the machines that seemed unbeatable on the battlefield. But history often hides its quiet truths beneath the noise. And the truth of World War II is that one of the most decisive weapons was not forged in armor or carved in steel. It was carried in wires, dials, and static. It was the radio. For the men inside the Sherman, it was a lifeline. In the chaos of combat, with shells bursting, engines roaring, and death just a heartbeat away, a voice crackling through the headset was more than just information. It was hope. It meant they were not alone. It meant someone had their back. And it meant they could fight, not as isolated machines, but as one living, breathing army. For the Germans, this was the invisible enemy they never fully understood. Their tanks were magnificent predators, perfect for the duel. But war isn't a series of duels. It's a storm, unpredictable and shifting every second. In that storm, the Americans had lightning-fast communication, and the Germans were left chasing shadows. This is why Shermans, mocked and underestimated, became symbols of Allied advance. They weren't invincible because of armor or firepower. They were invincible because they were never alone. And in war, unity is often deadlier than raw strength. Looking back now, the story of the Sherman is more than just a tale of machines. It's a lesson that technology is only as powerful as the way it connects people. The Sherman's radio was the bridge between men, units, and nations. It was the whisper in the storm that guided armies forward. As the war ended and the guns fell silent, the world began to understand. Future armies would never fight the same way again. Communication became the backbone of strategy, the unseen force that turned battles into victories. The Germans had learned it too late. The Americans had mastered it just in time. So when we remember the Sherman tank, we shouldn't just remember the steel, or the firepower, or the sheer numbers. We should remember the voices carried inside it, the messages, the calls for help, the orders that turned chaos into clarity. Because those voices, more than any shell or cannon, helped win a war that changed the world. The Sherman was more than a tank. It was proof that connection, unseen, unheard, but always there, can turn the tide of history. And sometimes, the strongest weapon of all is the one you can't even see.